Morning. Today is 24 February 2022, and we're living in tumultuous times. Apparently, Russia and the Ukraine are not happy with each other, and whatever results may come, we hope for peace. This is Jen at the Liberty Lion, and today I'm going to review some information and teach people who have recently subscribed to my channel who may not have gone through the last videos I posted on state, to teach them what state is and how it's used. So there are people out there, and there have been for a long time, and even Napolitano has suggested as much, and that is that the federal constitution is in fact an amendment to the Articles of Confederation. I've come across some information that says this, and so if the Constitution is an amendment to the Articles of Confederation, it's an amendment to the articles that talk about setting up the military, or also called the dependent states or non-sovereign states, the states in service to the country. So what I'm going to talk about here is in relation to the Constitution and what the states of the Constitution are, as well as the states not in the Constitution. So you have the Articles of Confederation, that is a firm league of friendship between independent states, and their acknowledgement that they need dependent states, which is a military, and that they also acknowledged that they needed an amendment to the Articles of Confederation on how exactly, or more accurately, they're going to run the dependent states. And so when the Constitution talks about states, it's talking about the dependent states that the Articles of Confederation allowed for the creation of. So the Articles of Confederation are the independent, sovereign, free states, and the Constitution is for the military states, which are the dependent, non-sovereign states. If you can understand that, then you don't need to watch the rest of this video. If you're confused, then hopefully this video will clear some things up. So what is a state? We have different types of states. The government can only regulate classes of persons, and according to the Constitution, there's only a few classes of persons that the federal government can regulate. So classes of persons are things such as the federal state, so the federal people, the employees and officers of the federal government. The military state, which discludes civilians, so civil servants are not included in the military. A peaceful state, war state, or war state, meaning a situation, and meaning a actual department. A public state and a private state. So different types of states depending on what class of person you are. Of course, there's many classes of people. There are wealthy, there are poor. So the federal government controls classes of persons that are in the dependent states, so the military and the civil servants. Classes of persons are states, and classes of persons as states are, for example, the following: public, private, military, officer, enlisted, sovereign, non-sovereign, dependent, independent, royal, such as a royal state and its relationship to its subjects, wealthy and poor. Now let's put the classes of persons into classes. The federal state is a military state, has officers. In the Constitution are called land and naval forces, or Army and Navy. Enlisted. Today enlisted are part of the federal state. However, The militia, it's misspelled, sorry about that, is part of the private state. The class of private persons, they were originally called privates. Today they are classed as enlisted and are part of the federal state. The federation or federal government has states. The federal states are dependent states. Dependent states are non-sovereign states. They're servants. The federal government are servants. They're non-sovereign. Its states are under federal control. So the states that the federal government creates are under federal control. That's the military. You have the seat and you have the military posts. They are federal lands. They are federal military posts under federal control, being the seat. The independent states are the states we commonly think of as states. These are the ones in the Articles of Confederation. The independent states created the federal government. They gave it some lands. They were able to give it lands because each state owned all of its lands. The federal government did not own any lands. So the independent states gave up some lands to form the dependent military state under federal control. States under federal control are called dependent states. States not under federal control are called independent states. These are the ones in the Articles of Confederation, and yes, it still exists. It's an organic law. It's there. And these independent states created or allowed for the creation of the dependent states. It's commonly held misconception through various techniques, whatever you want to call them, brainwashing, indoctrination, hypnosis, propaganda, education, taking over the public schools, etc. It's a misconception that the federal government are the controllers of the independent states. The independent states. The federal government does not control the independent states. As a matter of fact, law after law after law after law has been written that says they have control only on federal lands. The people coming off the federal lands are not part of the federal government. Likely they have no commission, even though they might have an oath. The independent states may create dependent states. It would look like this in the congressional records. Virginia, not state of Virginia, Virginia ceded some lands to the United States to be erected into the dependent state, state of Virginia, for military purposes. This is the way they wrote it. Virginia ceded some lands to the United States to be erected into state of Virginia. Or here's another example. Tennessee has sold some lands to the United States to be erected into state of Tennessee. I will restate the above in my own language so that you can better understand what this short sentence says. The free sovereign and independent state, Tennessee, has ceded some lands to the United States federal state to build a military post, or could be military posts, for the mutual defense of all states and regulated by the federal state. And the new areas under federal control will now be a dependent, non-sovereign state called State of Tennessee. So the free, sovereign, and independent state, Tennessee, ceded some lands so that the federal government can organize fort building or military post building on those ceded lands. Let's try restating it again for Texas. The free, sovereign, and independent state, created by the sovereign people, to which they called the Republic of Texas, has erected itself. So the free, sovereign, and independent people of the land of Texas erected themselves into their own state called the Republic of Texas. Now, this is a free, sovereign, and independent state government created by free, sovereign, and independent people under the Articles of Confederation. Now that they are an independent state, they may sell some lands to the United States, the federal state created for military purposes. The lands they sold to the United States have been erected or will be erected into a dependent, non-sovereign state regulated by the federal government or seat of government for military purposes, in order that the seat of government may defend all the independent states mutually. So recently, Judge Napolitano said, what if one state ceded from the Union? A bunch of people went into that state and rejoined a union only for their own mutual defense. And that's what I'm telling you the Constitution says. That's what it does. The Constitution only creates dependent states inside of independent states for mutual defense. It is not, has not, never will be, never can be an independent state or erect itself into an independent state, or any of its federal areas erect into an independent state. None of its federal areas can cede from the Union and become an independent state because they're a creation of the independent states. And it's in the Constitution that they can't. That was a stipulation to that contract, to the stipulation of joining, is that they didn't create themselves into an independent state. So we look now at the Constitution where it states, a state may not be erected into a state. It's kind of confusing, but remember, the Constitution is only talking about the Constitution is only talking about dependent states. It's military forts. So it's saying that any state it creates cannot be erected into a state, an independent state. So a dependent state cannot become an independent state. It cannot cede itself from the independent state and join the Articles of Confederation to become a free, sovereign, and independent state because it's a military and it's in service to, as a dependent state, it's in service to the independent states. And that's in the Constitution. It promised we won't try to do that. And that's exactly what they've done because they've allowed their instrumentalities to become a government. So this is confusing for some people. I'll try to explain what it means. The Constitution does not, cannot control independent states which are sovereign. Therefore, independent states are not the states the Constitution is talking about. It is the dependent states it created as a means of establishing exactly what is and what is not, as well as what it can and what it cannot do. The Constitution states that it has control only over the dependent states. But when it's talking about states, it doesn't say dependent states because it's known. It's known because the Constitution was and is an amendment to the Articles of Confederation. So you'll have to read the Articles of Confederation where it talks about the free, sovereign, and independent states shall remain free, sovereign, and independent states. And the military and the federal government is a dependent state to those independent states. But if I write classes of persons and I say federal, I can only be talking about dependent states. Anytime you see federal, it's naturally talking about dependent states because the independent states are in the Confederation. This is why a lot of what they write is confusing because people don't even understand what the Constitution says. They believe that the Constitution created the state that they live in, but how can that be when the state that they live in created the Constitution and agreed to it? Agreed to the creation of the dependent states within the independent states. So when the independent state gives or sells lands to the federal government, it does so specifically, according to the Constitution, the erection of military posts. The military posts together inside an independent state are called dependent state. Let's go back and read my rewrite of the earliest congressional records. So my rewrite. The free, sovereign, and independent states created by the sovereign people to which they called the Republic of Texas has erected itself. Now that they are a state, they may sell, which is the same as cede, some lands to the seat of government called United States. This is the federal state created for military purposes. The lands they sold to the United States for federal purpose for creating a military have been erected into a dependent, non-sovereign state regulated by the federal government for military purposes in order that the seat of government may defend all the independent states mutually. The independent states allowed for the erection of new states called federal dependent states. The federal dependent states cannot be further broken down. Therefore, the jurisdiction, which is power and authority, was given to the federal government for certain purposes, and one of those was not to break that dependent state down into further dependent states or even into an independent state. So when a man sells his property, he may choose to retain some rights to it, such as mineral rights. The independent states retain the right to cede from the Union, which means taking back the lands it ceded to the federal government, called United States, those lands to be erected into post or dependent states. Not to have the dependent states broken down further into more dependent or independent states. Not to create a state within a state. And other things, but we won't get into those other things because right now we're talking about the states. So the federal government cannot erect inside the federal lands an independent state. If you think about it, it makes sense. Thinking about it, the Constitution in this way brings everything together, makes everything make sense. When you try to think about the things that they teach you in school, it doesn't quite add up. So thinking about it and its an original intent makes the entire system of government make sense. Not only does it make sense, but you'll begin to see that the federal government really has but very, very little power. And the people, the private people and their independent states have and always have had and still maintain its original sovereign power. Therefore, according to the Constitution, the laws of the United States, the congressional records, and the records of the independent states, the federal government was given control over certain land areas inside the states for the erection of forts to carry out certain acts stated within the Constitution. That the areas are posts, and these posts are dependent states. That they are dependent because they are non-sovereign. They are non-sovereign because they depend on others for their pay, their housing, their medical, their food. They do not produce on their own. They are there constantly training, educating, representing, in order that they may provide and ensure certain things to the independent states, joined in a firm league of friendship under the Articles of Confederation that created them. Those are the things listed in the preamble of the Constitution: freedom, defense, liberty, general welfare, etc. And you see the United States dependent state works to do things for the independent states, United States of America. They do not have the power to force, as they serve at the pleasure of the people of the independent state. They are a military. At this point, some people will assume that I mean to say that the military would be better than what we have now. I do not mean to say that. I do not say that. It is not my intention. My intention is that you understand what the federal government is and what the federal government is not. It was never intended to be a group of corporations or a military industrial complex contracting with private citizens in the independent state, basically to take over the independent states. Is what they've done. Today, that's basically what the federal government is: a group of corporations plundering the land, taking us to war, plundering the property of the private people, etc. All as instrumentalities of the military. But even worse than that, they are pretending to be a federal government when they are not. The federal government, according to the Constitution, was and is confined to doing work on the federal lands. Its officers all have to have a commission, and those lands were ceded to it for the erection of forts, and its officers to reside on. These forts were to be used as training places for the militia when called into actual service. These posts or forts are dependent, non-sovereign states, overseen by a federal government, which is a dependent, non-sovereign state. Review. States are of many types. Sovereign states may create non-sovereign states. Sovereign states may create non-sovereign states, which is the same thing as saying independent states may create dependent states. People can create institutions, corporations, instrumentalities, etc. as tools. Tools are used as a means to an end. So institutions, corporations, and instrumentalities are tools, and tools are used as a means to an end to achieve a goal. The independent states allowed for the erection of a dependent state called federal state. The federal state is a military state. The seat is the head of the military state. The federal lands inside the independent states are the dependent states controlled by the seat or head, Washington, D.C. Washington had 2 commissions. Then he was named Commander-in-Chief, President of the United States military. The President is the highest ranking officer, and he is to be at and remain at his posted position as head protector of the independent states in the White House. This is his post. If he has gone from his post for too long, he is MIA, or missing in action, or has abandoned his post. The White House is not there for show. It's not an official office. It's his home because he's in the military, and the military provides its officers with homes because they are not supposed to leave their post. The White House is a post. It's a military housing unit for the commander-in-chief. All military posts have housing. There are a number of officers that must remain on post at all times. If the military post has been abandoned, these posts are free to be taken over. They can't be abandoned. They have to be manned at all times. That's why the officers have to remain on the military posts. To remain on the military post, they have to have housing. There must always be a certain number of officers on the federal lands. They must live on the federal lands. This is why they have housing. They cannot abandon their posts. This is why the president lives in the White House. The White House is not a place as an official office, but because it is a house and he lives there, he conducts official business in his private office that is in the White House. The seat of government is a dependent state. It is a federal state. It is subject or servant or the erection or the creation of the independent states. Therefore, the federal government is a non-sovereign state subject to the commands of the independent state and has rights only to do those things in the Constitution, which does not include force against any private citizen in the independent states. As a matter of fact, the president can only command the militia when it is called into actual service. So, if the militia is commanded by the president only when called into actual service, how can he command any private person when not called into service and not in a service capacity, not in the militia? Only the public officers are under president's command, and the militia when called into actual service. All public officers that are federal officers, that's the military, are to be commissioned. All commissioned officers have authority or power only on the federal lands because they are part of the dependent state. The end. I hope that you understood this. If you did not, please post your questions in the comments section. This is not stuff that I am arbitrarily making up off the top of my head. This is stuff I learned while serving in the military, while working as a civil servant. This is stuff I learned from them. This is the stuff that they explained to me. This is how it works. If you want to accept it or not, that's on you. But if you want a smaller government and you want to understand what all the documents really mean and why the federal government has no power over you, which gives you the power, which some people for some reason like to fight against the idea of the people having power over its government. You need to understand this, and this is what I'm telling you. And once you start reading the documents, if you choose to do so, you will understand that I am telling you the truth, that this is the way it is. You don't have a Bill of Rights. You have all your rights. The Bill of Rights applies to the people on the federal lands. That was one of the incentives to joining the military. You get a house, you get medical, you get uniform, you get arms, you get pay, you give up rights for those things, but you're able to maintain some of them. Okay? When it talks about the 10th Amendment, it's talking about the people of the state providing for some rights for their military people in their state. Okay, all other rights are guaranteed by the states and the people in the states for their military people. Okay, and those are just things that the states wanted in there once they joined in the Union. They wanted to make sure that they maintained control over their federal lands and their federal people because the states selected who was going to be a military officer, and then the military officer applied in the report of record at the district court, the federal district court. They applied, and then they were accepted, and then they moved on to the military post, and they stayed there as a commissioned officer. Once they had so much time as a commissioned officer in the state, but not an inhabitant of the state, as the Constitution says, they're able to go to the seat of government as a representative of all the states, working for the agency. So all these Congress people who have never served in the military are not qualified to be there. Okay, so there you have it. Believe it or not. If you don't believe it, go read the documents for yourself. Go join the military and see what they tell you. Go become a civil servant and see what they tell you. They're going to tell you exactly what I'm telling you. This whole facade, this whole idea of they get to tell you whatever they want is being done by the corporations. The corporations are propagandizing to you. They're brainwashing you. They're indoctrinating you. They took over the education system. Those are the corporations, the military-industrial complex. Those non-positive laws, those non-positive titles, without a positive enacting clause, not laws. Okay? So please consider like, share, subscribe, leave comments. We can talk about it. If you have a question and I have a long answer, I'll make another video and reply and post the link to your question. Okay, so pass this on to your friends. Try to understand it so you can explain it to them. And I appreciate all the support that everyone gives me. And I'll see y'all in the next video.